Um, okay, so for our next speaker, we have Kimberly Herrema. Hopefully I said that right again. So as a service designer, Kim is very passionate about understanding how people experience the world and has held roles across finance, education, and healthcare industries. Her expertise areas include strategic leadership, service design, works technology, adoption, behavior design, entrepreneurship, and UX research. Kim also holds a master's in intercultural education and a doctorate in educational leadership. Before I welcome her to the stage, I just want to remind you guys that after this presentation, we're going to have like a 15-minute intermission. In that time, feel free to go on next door to the next room, get something to eat, and just network. Okay, so speaking with oh. So speaking with Kimberly is going to be Savannah Mirashi. She's the senior service designer and researcher. A little background about her. She's a strategist with an intimate passion for discovering and observing new environment, cultures, user behaviors, and builder engagement. She's also researching for the human story behind most complex and biggest challenges. Also speaking is Shawn Merrill, who is the director of innovation and design. Yeah, he's gonna welcome them. Friend. Who? Do you want to get this on me? Good. I'll show you guys. All right. So he's passionate about improving people lives. That's what draws him to him and the intersection of business and human-centered design. He's very curious to understand what makes people tick and to create insight about what's most important to them. He loves to innovate, prototype, and test his way into a better future for all and everything. So they're a museum, by the way. So in person is yes, in person is Ken, and then Savannah and Shawn will be museum. Yep. Yeah.
We're good? Okay. Great. Thanks for the introduction. Hi, everyone. I'm Kim. And like she said, my wonderful colleagues, Sav, Mirashi, and Shawn Merrill are on screen. If you guys could wave, that'd be great. Yeah. Right. Dude, that's awesome. So hopefully you've had a chance to look. We've got a prompt here for you. And first of all, can you hear me okay? And we're going to keep the microphone kind of closer to the computer so these two voices come through. But yes, the average WIAD experience in the USA has this in common. That's a big prompt for you while we wait, pun intended. Yeah, I think we'll go ahead and move it forward because I think we've got everyone sitting down. So the answer is not a lot. ERs are very unique in scope. They're unique in patient demographics. They're unique in layout and staffing. And so today we're going to talk about navigating the ER context and the idea of power of designing with, not for, which was really cool to hear in the last talk. We're going to talk about what that looked like us for today in terms of working in the ER space. So if you go to the next slide, we are with a company called Providence, which is a healthcare consortium down the West Coast. It's in Alaska, California, Oregon, Washington, Texas, Montana, and New Mexico. So really geographically diverse as well. The three of us are also distributed. Sav is in California. Shawn joins us today from Pennsylvania, and I work here in Minnesota. So about a year and a half ago, we started working on this new project. We learned very quickly that if you've seen one ER, you've seen one ER. Our team, we're on a service design team that was within Providence. And the team started about 2 years ago. And what we quickly found was that there was a bit of a hazing ritual that seemed to happen when people joined the team. We all had some sort of a medical experience shortly after joining. Mine, I had two. The first one was a couple of months after I started. My daughter was really struggling to breathe. She was, her numbers, we had our oxygen counter thing at home and it was kept going down. So we took her into the emergency room. I just remember being a very frantic drive. They got her right in the door. And then we sat with her while we kind of tried to see and watch her numbers, creep back up. She was on oxygen. Very frenetic. I don't remember the waiting room. We were really panicked. I know I left the prescription in the pharmacy. So there was a lot of, I think my brain wasn't quite, all there when I was going through that experience. The second one was a year later. She decided to get really fancy with her moves on the play equipment and did an extra jump off of the tower. This one was different. We thought she was okay. Then we noticed the next day she was walking a little funny. So we decided to take her in. We weren't sure if we should go to ER, if we should go to urgent care. But we wandered in. That one we waited a few hours. There was a digital app for the experience that really helped guide us through the experience. I noticed we saw a few more people before we got to the treatment. But I think those two experiences that I had just showed how different those patient journeys can be. And that's with the same people. You have a lot of other factors. That you have insurance, right? That's one that really can change your experience. Are you housed? Are you able to find where you're going and how to look for it? So lots of different journeys into the ER space. And then once you get there, again, very different experiences. But we're going to back up. I would love to have Sav talk about how we got on this project, how this project started. So she's going to take it from here.
Thanks, Kim, and thanks for the wonderful introduction. Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me all right. Just wave to Kim or just let her know if at any point we drop off or you have trouble and we can repeat ourselves. But the way this project started, so it's a classic how might we statement, right? So what are you really trying to solve for? We saw wait time as a big opportunity from a patient sentiment perspective. We had the opportunity to really impact our patient satisfaction scores. In our healthcare lingo, we call those as Press Gini scores in the emergency department. It was one of the areas where we were scoring lowest consistently in those readings. And through this effort, we made a goal to improve the perception of wait time for patients. And improving the actual wait time if we could, but in cases where it wasn't in our control, improving the perception felt like it was the right move at that time. We also guardrailed it in a way where we were seeking near-term solutions, so things that we could develop in the next 3 to 6 months. And ultimately, we also wanted to the solution to serve as an experience kit of sorts, knowing there's a huge variety of emergency departments across even Providence, but across the entire system, and wait rooms with varying contexts and needs within our system. So for patient populations of different sizes, demographics, we needed to address different challenges. I think Kim's stories also highlight how different those could be for the same patient, depending on the need, right? So we wanted a solution that could address the complexity that comes with that. So if you see on this slide, this might be something that's familiar to some of you, but it's the double diamond process. And while we didn't feel it's as linear or clean as depicted on the slide, this is roughly how we approached it. So we spent that fuzzy front end, the red and yellow or orange boxes on there to answer the why and the what, and then build an implementation phase to answer the how and to rapidly experiment and test in our role markets that we serve. So for today, we're going to mostly focus on how we implemented the solution and how that context was critical to ensure success. But first, let's spend a little time on how we got here. So to initially get to our solution, an enormous amount of discovery work was conducted to define the solution that you'll see in a few moments. So we engaged a team of cross-functional stakeholders, which included our physicians, our registration staff, nurses, C-suite leadership in a make-to-learn process. And designers hate this slide. It makes them really uncomfortable because of the overwhelming amount of information that we have on here. but we've never changed it because when we do this process, there's a method to it. It's very rigorous, it's process oriented, but we don't limit ourselves in terms of how we iterate. So we utilize primary and secondary research and a series of experience workshops to document that ER experience, create journey maps, create service blueprints, identify pain points, need statements, rounds and rounds of ideation and prioritization exercises. And you're seeing some of those artifacts from our ideation process here. And this gave us a lot of insights into the systemic challenges, varying contexts, and situational barriers for both our patients as well as our caregivers. So what you see now on the slide is eventually the prioritized solution that we led into that experimentation and pilot phase. So this is what we call the patient companion. And I think the beauty of this solution is that it had no to very limited digital elements. It was actually a person that we wanted to pilot with. So this is a non-clinical caregiver who's specially trained to have warm interactions with our patients, rounding on patients in the ER, checking in on them, providing care items whenever appropriate, and helping them feel comfortable in the process. And we identified 4 primary responsibilities in the form of guiding principles for this role. So we wanted to make sure this companion focuses on empathy over efficiency, practices active listening, recognizes and acknowledges the patients that come in, as well as the family and friends that they bring in, as well as always speaks to the why. Why are patients being asked certain things, or why are they experiencing what they are? So we completed a robust discovery process, had defined the first solution to try. Um, so then we go to how do we implement a rigorous and mindful approach, right, to the solution. And Shawn will walk you through that next phase.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. So we got to this point where it's like we got this great idea, but what are we going to do about it, and how are we going to actually test this out? And a critical element that you'll hear throughout our share out today is the importance of vulnerability. Without it, the patient companion pilot would have never gotten off the ground. One thing Kim didn't mention, but you might have deduced from our introductions, is that our team is new to healthcare. I think Kim and I have the longest tenure on our team of 2 years, coming up on 2 years, I think, about. So in some ways, we've been able to use this newbie card a little bit to our advantage to help people that we work with to be more open and vulnerable with sharing with us. For example, I allow myself to be vulnerable pretty frequently in conversations with subject matter experts. And I say, look, this isn't my expertise. I don't know this subject matter. And it's a little bit hard for me to share sometimes because I like to know it all. But then I also share with them, you know what though, like I have some skills and I have confidence in my skills from other industry. And this sort of creates a mutual vulnerability between us that opens doors for our work. And it wasn't any different for when we started looking for a place to pilot this patient companion. In the ER space, caregivers, they understand how difficult that space can be. And often they're sometimes reluctant to sort of let outsiders into that world because it's chaotic. And how could somebody who's not in this with us every day really understand what we're going through, give voice to it, and solve problems in that space? And so creating space for experts to trust us enough, being vulnerable to allow their expertise to shine through, that was absolutely critical for us. This physician quote, this is a lead physician. She put it best in some feedback that she gave to us. She said, I didn't want to talk about our waiting room. I just felt powerless. And you created this space where we felt safe in showing our vulnerability. And I think that's why it worked. This same lead physician who gave us this quote was someone who in the beginning we felt was pretty skeptical of us and our solution. And in our first virtual meeting, it was filled with constraint after constraint, obstacle after obstacle. After that meeting, we were pretty bummed and we were like, well, there goes our pilot site. It's not going to happen here. We did, however, have this in-person site visit on the schedule to meet with these clinical stakeholders again. And we had this choice to make. We could, one, go in with this really solid sales pitch, give them all the information we had, show them all the work we've done, the research, the design. Or two, we could go in with no real agenda and ask them to show us their space, to listen, and to ask questions. And both options had their advantages and their disadvantages. Now, there's a image on the screen that you're probably wondering, what does this have anything to do with what he's talking about right now? Well, like this stream, that bridge that's created by the water, it didn't happen all at once. This stream listens for the context that the environment gives. It still creates a path forward around the rock, even if it's not the direct path or the ideal path planned from the beginning. And but the stream's it's not passive either. It's forever driven by the context. It's not forever driven by this context to go around. The stream also patiently and persistently carves out a new path and often alters the original context when the time is right and it bursts through. So we chose, when we had these options, option number 2, we went with no agenda. We went around the rock. We listened, we asked questions, we sought to understand the context, and that was a key unlock for us. It wasn't until the end of our visit that day that anyone even talked about the pilot that we were trying to propose. And when it was brought up, it was brought up by the critical stakeholders asking what we needed from them to make it happen. And so listening for context, understanding the context, being vulnerable with stakeholders helped us get through the rock to be able to actually do the pilot. And I think that's what really helped us to be able to launch it, was that vulnerability that we created.
Wonderful. Thank you. So this is where, once we had some of that trust, how do we now actually contextualize it, structure it in a way where it's adding value to what we want to achieve, right, to the pilot? So we tried out this exercise where we got the group together of these physicians, nurses, a very cross-collaborative group that was specific to that ministry. So we call our hospitals ministries in Providence. And what we essentially did was led a service design workshop. And this blueprint that you're seeing on screen, some of you might be familiar, but this is the service blueprint. It had a lot more details. But one thing we wanted to ensure is, again, like thinking back on what the context for this audience is, right? We wanted to ensure we're not overwhelming them by just bombarding them with all the information at one time. So Shawn actually came up with a genius idea on this, where the way we presented this was layered information. So if you see all the swim lanes almost color-coded on this, we made sure we were only engaging or opening stuff where we needed them to focus on. So we started with the patient journey because that was always where we wanted to focus on, we wanted to bring value to. And then eventually unravel some of the other swim lanes around the caregiver experience, how the companion will play, what will get affected. And we also sprinkle this entire map with our own questions or comments that you may or may not catch, depending on the screen size right now, but those are the blue and the yellow boxes that you see. That was another attempt from us to just simplify it as much as possible and only share information that is the most contextually relevant. And this really helped us answer and prioritize and guardrail that role, because this role also had the risk of running into being everything at once while not serving anywhere, right? So eventually what came out of those workshops was these prioritized touch points within that patient journey. And we, throughout those ministries that we had these work sessions with, we heard about entry point where the patient arrives, as well as right after the patient is checked in, and when they're waiting, or at the risk where they're leaving without being seen. And leaving without being seen is a touch point where the patient hasn't been seen by a physician, but is either anxious, nervous, or is just tired of waiting and decides to leave even before that happens. So these were the biggest value adds from this group's perspective where we needed to focus on. But surprise, surprise, at each pilot location, we soon found out that it's not as simple or straightforward. So if you see the little bubble on the left, is where it started looking pretty different. So for instance, at our first launch in California, it was a very linear flow on what that patient experience looked like, where the patient would walk in, talk to the security, do their check-in with the registration desk, interact with the first nurse or the triage nurse, as we call them, and then wait for their full triage. But at our second launch, once we went to Oregon, that process looked completely different, where registration was first, followed by wait, and eventually a triage nurse coming to meet and greet them. Texas was a whole different ballgame altogether. So we wanted to make sure all of these contexts are also built into that solution, and the companion role sort of pivots according to the needs of those individual ministries. So there was a lot of redesign even through this process. And I'll pass it to Shawn to talk a little bit about how we sort of customized all of those touch points and scripted those. So Shawn.
As this process, listening with our clinical stakeholders was really important to understand their context, to hear their needs. But it was also important when we went to train companions that we listen to the context of the companions themselves. For example, this one touch point, we identified at entry or arrival. You can imagine as you enter the ER, it's confusing. Kim's example at the beginning of today was perfect for that. There's a lot going on, and it's a perfect place for a warm welcome from someone like a patient companion. However, arrival is also a place where clinical staff needs to be most efficient because they need to identify those conditions and prioritize care as fast as possible when someone walks through the doors. And we knew that we couldn't do anything to slow down a patient from getting to the clinical staff to be able to assess their needs. And so with this in mind, we intentionally took that context and we scripted this entry point, touch point, this arrival touch point with a yes or no question. So it met all of the needs of the context that we discovered. And we asked, right when somebody arrived, we asked, are you here to see a doctor? And that accomplishes multiple things. It's a yes or no question, so it creates brevity. Patients love to talk about why they're there. And we didn't want our patient companion diving into that. We want the clinical staff to hear that. So yes or no, brevity. And it immediately lets the companion know where to route that person. If they're a patient, if they're there to see a doctor, they go to the clinical staff. If they're a visitor, they go down, they go a different path. And then that friendly smile and greeting right at entry immediately showed care and immediately showed empathy. And it let our patients know what the role of the companion was. It was help you to get to where you're going, answer questions. Which created a really nice space for patients to know how to use the companions. As we were training our companions to do this work, this is a service. So there's this context of who that person is who's performing the service. And we had to modify each of these scenarios to meet the identity of the person who was going to be doing it. So we launched, I think we had 5 different companions by the end, and each one was very different in the way that they approached their work. And so we had to take that context of who that companion was, the rock, but we also had to adhere to the clinical input that we'd received to make sure we forged a new bridge and that they were able to also adjust to a new context. And so during our trainings, we consistently asked ourselves, how can we infuse this person's personality, this person's character into the role? One of our companions was like witty and joking, and he wore these dark black sweaters with bright strawberries on them. And we're going to take that. That's his context. Go with that. Another one of our caregivers, super sweet and sort of soft spoken, but warm and really made you feel good. And so during our training, we would get to know them. We would then walk through a script together. We would role play together. We'd go to the ER and we practice together. We give feedback, and we allowed for this ability for us to understand their context, but then also get them out of their comfort zones by the end. And so we took context really seriously throughout this entire design process, which then got us to the point where we were watching them in action, which Kim will tell us a little bit more about what that looked like.
Yes, and Shawn, we got about 5 minutes, so I just want to be conscious of time too.
Right, thank you.
Yeah. So I was super lucky to join the team right as we were launching our very first pilot, and we went in and we did our role plays, we trained, we did role plays, we got into the ER, and I was doing ethnography or observation of the process, and sitting there, it was really fascinating to watch because as the companion would approach a person, and provide just that welcome, Wi-Fi information, letting them know they were there as a resource, you could see people's shoulders just drop. Like there was just a really physical relaxation that you could read from the folks that they were interacting with. And we would hear it all the time from our nurses and our clinicians. Like we could feel it working, which is wonderful, so impactful. we also need to bring back information on what those outcomes were to the organization. So what does that actually look like? What can we measure to show that it's working? And so this next section we're going to go through here is about measurement. So Shawn, you want to kick off maybe how we found that North Star metric?
Yeah. So, Sav already talked about this and gave a really great description of what this was. Leave without being seen. It's a metric where we don't want patients leaving our ER without being seen by a doctor. And it's important for everyone involved. It worries, first of all, it's bad for the patient if they leave. It worries healthcare professionals, creates liability, and from a business perspective, it's literally money walking out our door. And so it's a really important metric to a lot of our stakeholders. And one of our first questions when we established that was, hey, how will we measure this? And we explored lots of tools. Ultimately, all those tools were contextually really hard. And so we got scrappy and we had this really unlikely solution. We used to gather our data a project management tool you've probably heard of called Asana. And now before any of you report us to HIPAA, we scrubbed up all our data. So there was no personal identifying information that we put into Asana. But we lucked out with this scrappy tool that we could measure with because it allowed us to quickly adjust based off our learnings and quickly get the data that we needed to understand if this was working right away. And we had control over it. So it wasn't a traditional use of Asana, but it really helped us to get scrappy to be able to measure that outcome that we're driving towards. So Kim, tell us a little bit more about the actual data.
The other super cool thing about Asana that it allowed us to do is really flexible. As we gathered data, we could kind of keep a continual learning loop of what we knew. So for example, leave without being seen, if we had that in our mind as something where people would just kind of storm out of the ER or they'd be really stealth about it. And we quickly found that there were all these other nuances that our companion was picking up on. They were asking some questions like, or Shawn, if you'll go ahead there. There was things like, is this how long it usually takes? Am I wasting time? Is there a better time to be here? We also found push and pull factors that we didn't anticipate. Now I have to go home. I have to pick up my kids. I have to feed my cat. I have to go to work. A lot of things surface that will help us with future solutioning. There's also, we found people leaving with reasons that were actually very good and very natural. Like if there was something that we're looking for after a surgery that then popped up while they were at the ER, they could go home. So we got to learn and then adjust and then keep learning. I think one of the cool things on the next slide, even though we had this North Star goal, capturing this data allowed us to find a lot of additional things that mattered to different people. So the first one that we found was that this decreased interruption. So ER doctors notorious for getting interrupted like 6 to 10 times an hour. And when that happens, they sometimes, I think 18% abandon the initial task, or they have errors increasing. So this was wonderful for our clinical staff. They said, I know when the companion's there, I can get to what I need to do and then get back out. It creates communities. So we found that this is a connector of roles across the ER between security, clinicians, and registrars, which helped increase time to care. Another one that we found was that satisfaction for patients and our caregivers really increased. We have one companion leave and another one come in, and we saw the satisfaction dip that came right back up, which was really cool. And then the last one of the things we really work on is to connect people to that financial assistance that they need when they're coming through. The trust that the companion built increased our ability to get that information we needed to help connect them to care. So that was a really unanticipated but cool finding. So overall, we'll just kind of wrap up here with our metrics. We gathered over 10,000 patient interactions, which can help us with future solutions. We did decrease leave without being seen numbers by about 1.8%, which yields around $1 million for the actual hospital. And then the Press-Ganey lift was around 5 to 10%. So I think we made it close to time. So we would thank you for listening. This has been a really fun, fabulous project to work on. We'd love to take any questions you have if we have a minute, or I'm happy to answer questions after too. We tried a little bit because it's so different. Oh yeah, it's so funny. Yeah, their flow was entirely different. So they actually had the plexiglass when you entered. They had the person behind the station, the registrar, and then behind them were the nurses. And so when a patient would come in, the nurse would kind of eyeball the patient to see how serious it was and decide if they needed to wait or come back into triage right away. And so it was it wasn't a nurse touch point per se. It was more of a look-see. And so we had to figure out how to like route that patient in and let them explain to them what that clinical role was. So it's just a different flow. Yeah. Thanks. Great question. Yeah. What? Great question. Yeah. This started the discovery started way back in 2022, the spring of 2022. The pilots, process creating the pilots was summer of 2022. We launched in the fall. And then we had a couple last spring as well. The outcome is really interesting because we are, our pilot that we did kind of proved out the points we were hoping to prove out. So that is sunsetted. But what we've seen happen is that other hospitals are popcorning and picking it up with other funding means. So that's been pretty fun. And we're hoping that traction will continue across the org. Yeah. And do we need that? Yes. Okay. I'll take any questions.